Welcome to Ideas of India, where we examine the academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Today, my guest is Rahul Sagar, who is the Global Network Associate Professor of Political Science at NYU Abu Dhabi. And he's the author of two recent books, The Progressive Maharaja, Sir Madhava Rao's Hints on the Art and Science of Government, and the second, To Raise a Fallen People, the 19th-Century Origins of Indian Views on International Politics. We spoke about the Enlightenment ideas of Sir Madhava Rao, his public finance constitutionalism, company rule and misrule, the railways, finding India's lost histories from the 19th century, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit discoursemagazine.com. Hi, Rahul. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here. This is such a pleasure.
Thanks, Shruti. It's a delight on my end, too.
I want to first start with the Progressive Maharaja. This is your work on Sir Madhava Rao. This is Sir T. Madhava Rao, who was, the Diwan of Travancore and then Indore and then Baroda. One of the most celebrated I don't know what to call him. I mean, he's a minister, but he's also a bureaucrat. He gets the honorific of a Raja. But to start with your big theme, which is, his work on the art and science of government based on his lectures to the King of Baroda, what struck me at the end of that is this quote by Adam Smith: "Little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. All the rest being brought about by the natural course of things." I was just struck by how much of that I saw in this book. Is this sort of Enlightenment thinking, was it popular during that time? Is Madhava Rao unique in bringing that to India? It doesn't seem to be a big theme in the way the company ran things.
That's a really lovely framing of the conundrum during this period that Madhava Rao is dealing with. So in the background, you're absolutely right, at least in Indian India, which is to say in the Indian principalities, in the native states as they were called at that time, there was absolutely no sense of this broader Enlightenment and early, what we would call early liberal thinking about markets, individuals, and individuality. The emphasis in the world that Madhava Rao is circulating in and sharing these ideas with are people that have a couple of different ideas in their heads. One is sort of the classical idea that the purpose of the ruler, the monarch, is to maintain order. And that's the most important thing. The social order, the political and religious order, and stability is essential, and defense and things of those kinds. So that's the Arthashastra and the Kautilyan tradition or the Chanakyan tradition that we're familiar with, but it has multiple versions, multiple commentaries. They're read, they're understood. The darbars of the Maharajas are not vacant spaces. It's not like they don't have ideas. They really think hard about this. They're often educated in these ideas in their early education. But this is one idea out there, and it has very little like Adam Smith in it. Though, of course, as we know, Chanakya and others have this deep understanding of the importance of markets and trade and commerce, but it isn't fixed on the individual. And on, as you were so nicely pointing out when you were citing there that famous paragraph, that quotation, it isn't focused on the natural inclinations of people. It's what the king organizes and structures. And the other great idea that's circulating at this time, and particularly in Western India, the Maratha states, is the idea that the king, and particularly the nobles, the sardars, they have a certain social structure with certain values, which are all like they are in Rajasthan, like they are in even places like Travancore. They all are martial in one form or another. They should learn to ride horses. They should learn to fight. They should learn to wrestle, those sorts of things. And their primary focus should be on somehow trying to regain or at least maintain what little sovereignty is left to them. Into this world plops Madhava Rao with his education. He's the first batch of the first British school. So what's today Presidency College, back then was Madras High School, exposed straight away from the very beginning to these sets of primary texts. He reads Smith very, very carefully, thinks very hard about, and reads Hume very carefully, thinks very hard about these basic principles that we later, ascribe to the so-called the Enlightenment. He reads Montesquieu, he reads Locke. And from all of these figures, he takes away, exactly as you put your finger on it, this sense that really, what's essential is to create the conditions for individual enterprise and rationality to have its play. And this enterprise and rationality have been stifled or limited by a variety of things. He's not hostile to Indian culture. He thinks there's many valuable things in it, but there are practices, institutions, perversions that have emerged over time that have basically obscured the individual and obscured the kind of rational choice. And the last thing I'll just say on that is you'd asked about what was happening in British India. And this is where he tries to kind of draw out a unique story. It's absolutely true that the company is fairly focused on its own profits and focused on basically acquiring territory through the early years of Madhava's life, at least until 1857. It's still expanding. It's still sorting out its borders and its territory, and it's still fairly ruthless at moments. But in spite of that, the one thing that Madhava Rao sees in practice, so this is not so much from the principles that he's learning in school, but from the practice of the British, is that as they take over province after province, kingdom after kingdom, and principality after principality, like the Governor-General Dalhousie says when he almost takes over Travancore, he thinks that the natives of those places breathe a sigh of relief when the British take over. Why? Because now they have the basics of the rule of law, corruption is minimized or limited, and you get the essentials in terms of public infrastructure, spending on those things, and a much less amount of money being spent on either defense, because now security has gone away as an issue, or on patronage and courtly ritual. So he sees that in practice, wherever the British turn up, they produce far more economic growth and order and stability from the perspective of the ordinary person. There's that rule of law stability. Of course, the company is taking away the cream. We all are aware of that economic story. But on the ground, for the Ryot, for the farmer, for the cultivator, there's stability. So Madhava Rao mixes, to answer your question, these two things: the practice of the company on the ground and the theory that he learns in Madras High School about why it is this stuff is working out the way it is. It's because when you free up individuals, you get investment and consumption going, rather than people putting money under their huts in the ground, worried about the next raid that will take away their life savings.
I think on this last point, it's also striking because he basically grows up in Madras and, what is a modern day Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. And then, his first gig is in modern day Kerala. These are parts of, company rule quite far from the excesses of what they did in the 18th century and the 17th century in Bengal and Bihar and Odisha, right? So those excesses have already been curbed to some extent. By the time the company heads south and, conquers Mysore, it is a slightly different company with a lot more interest in bypassing, the old layer of Nawabs and Diwans and creating and developing some kind of local state capacity. And in some sense, Madhava Rao actually witnesses that. If he had been born in Bengal, I wonder if, he would have had the same experience or the same story, even if he had actually encountered the Enlightenment values.
Yeah, that's very nicely put. And they are, Bengali zamindars and so on, they don't have quite the same schooling or quite the same institutions, but Macaulay and others Charles Trevelyan are instrumental in setting up Hooghly College, for instance, and there are other institutions in Bengal. They're certainly exposed to these ideas, but they don't see in Bengal presidency, you're absolutely right, what they see in Madras presidency, and that includes Mysore and so on, it's not a part of Madras presidency, but it's visible what's happening there, is this sense that, by the 1820s, two crucial, the decade in which Madhava was born, the two crucial things that have changed is, first of all, the company's hold over India is now solidified. They've won the Third Anglo-Maratha War. They have no real competitors anywhere in the Deccan, all the way up to northern India. And, you only get to Sindh and Punjab before you encounter, or Nepal on the other extreme, where you encounter non-company forces. Even Ceylon has now come under the company. So, and the French have left all their little territories except for a handful, Chandranagore, Pondicherry, etc. So it puts the English in 1820, exactly as you put it, in a very different mindset. They're no longer, and you see this constantly in the archives, in their letters, in their minutes and memoranda. Now it's time to govern. And our fears of the French, our fears of insurrection, our fears of revolts are behind us. And again and again, when they write about the various royal families or the landlords who are even within their own territories, they say they're pacified. we should now treat them no longer as insurgents, but as loyal tributaries. You see this phrase again and again. So that's one very important thing. And the second one, which I think has been so fundamental, it was important for Madhava Rao to look at his entire family, and all of the people around him were in one way or the other involved in revenue collection. So they all saw this firsthand. But he saw it himself, was the introduction of the Rotwari system. And for that, Thomas Munro, who is the central pivotal governor for Madras presidency in this era, this is something that matters deeply to him. He's a man of the road. He dies on horseback, lives on horseback. And so he makes it a point to set in place systems and procedures and processes that will take away randomness and intimidation from the mind of the road. And this has, I think, a fundamental effect on Madras presidency, which you just do not see in other presidencies in quite the same way. And so growing up, Madhava, because of this different company, a company focused now on building infrastructure, on education and those sorts of things, and the visible practice put in place by people like Munro, who are loved by and large, in spite of their earlier conquests, they're still loved for their fair-mindedness, for their settlements, the Rotwari system. That puts him on a completely different trajectory, exactly as you said, from someone 20 or 30 years before. Tanjore, 30 years before Madhava was born, is a hellhole of intrigue, espionage, plots, assassination attempts. It's a whole different world. You're exactly right.
The other interesting thing, I think, is also what's happening in the rest of the world. So when we look at the late 18th century, the technocratic class is quite different in the sense that, when Cornwallis comes in and he takes over from Hastings in, I think, 1768 or so, given his experience in the US and how the Americans, who they thought were their own people, actually, sort of go against the crown, Cornwallis brings in all these prohibitions on, mixed race, officers in the civil service, in the military service, any children of mixed race couples cannot actually enter company service. So he starts bringing in all these sorts of really strange prohibitions where before that, the view was very much we need to assimilate, right? So Cornwallis creates this weird new technocratic class where Britishers need to be imported in, right? We're going to bring in these sort of aristocrats who will help us govern. And that becomes untenable as the territories get bigger and bigger. So, that's one part of it. But the other part of it is with the introduction of English and with the company simply not having the state capacity and enough officers for the amount of territory they've conquered, early 19th century to mid-19th century sees a new class of native-born but English-educated technocrats. And to me, it seems like Madhava Rao is really the first of that generation. I mean, so are his, father and uncle, but he's sort of like the breakout character in that generation. Is that a good way to think about that time and Madhava Rao, or is he just exceptional? And I'm trying to connect too many dots in this story.
No. You're exactly right, I think. I mean, the way you framed it is exactly how it works out. Between 1790, when Cornwallis returns for the second time, and he's also crucially succeeded by John Shore, and they have this
great debate.
Exactly. So you get this, this interregnum between the conquests. And during that time, they become very clear about the fact that they are trying to build a state that will last, a state that will replace what Cornwallis and others have lost in America. And so they now set themselves the task of, as I think the phrase is, the great project of actually founding the company's rule on sound principles. That's a phrase that appears again and again, sound principles. And so sound principles means you have to start rooting out corruption, the freewheeling ways of the earlier generations. You need to govern according to a set of clear procedures and rules. And the first 20 or 30 years in which this occurs, you're exactly right when you point to, Madhava Rao's father, but especially his uncle. They take very often Maratha Brahmins who've been engaged in the revenue business. It's not sort of linked so much to caste as it is to practice. These are figures that have worked in the revenue business, so to speak, for native princes, for the British as they slowly expand in the Deccan. And they understand the ways in which people function, the ways in which markets function, the ways in which people cheat. And crucially, they are dobashis. Almost all of them quickly pick up some form of, rudimentary English. And then some get pretty good at it, like Madhava's uncle, who's basically perfectly fluent in English and is a star of his generation. He is by far and away the most important revenue servant in all of southern India. And so the first generation are these, the famous description goes, every great Englishman in the Deccan has one or two Maratha Brahmins hanging around him at all times, basically solving all his problems that he doesn't actually know what to do with. So you go from that sort of, we call today a private secretary, right? They don't actually have a public function. They're working for you. They go from having that private secretary function to having a public secretary function in the 1830s and 40s, where they slowly start getting drafted in as tehsildars and as assistants and junior assistants, as Madhava Rao was, into the revenue administration, as the British now, exactly for the reasons you pointed out, limits on the willingness of people to come out, limits on the willingness of people to serve hardship postings, high levels of mortality and illness, and all of these kinds of things. So you get the need for, and as you rightly pointed out, expansion of territory. You get the need for people to be able to serve, be skilled in multiple languages, but crucially also understand what the British are trying to do. And so the difference between Madhava and all the generations or the two generations before him, his father and his uncle included, is that because he's schooled in English from the bottom up, they're not. They've learned on the job, on the fly. He's schooled from the bottom up. He can hold his own with absolutely anyone. He can sit in a conversation with the viceroy, as he does multiple times in his life, or with the governor, and have a conversation that moves equally between ancient Greece, modern France, and contemporary India or contemporary Madras, or whatever it might be. And that just creates a class and a type of person that for the next, really, frankly, 60 or 70 years has the run of the road in southern India.
And what I love about him, he is this solid public finance guy, right? Like just old school public finance. Yeah. Fiscal conservatism is sort of, in his bones. And the entire effort is very similar. We're running something called the 1991 project at the Mercator Center, where we look at the balance of payments crisis that happened in the late 80s and 1990, how India came out of it, the reforms. And so much of the first stage reforms in India at that time were just bringing deficits under control, having sensible value for currency, slashing tariffs, opening up to trade. And it's so interesting that when Madhava Rao goes to Travancore, that's literally exactly what he does, right? Make sure that you get deficits under control. There's actually a surplus by the end of it, which is also helped by the fact that they're not, maintaining these huge armies. They're not warring all the time. And company as the super sovereign is sort of established, right? So they have some military expenditure, but not like the previous century. And just cutting down tariffs, having sensible, customs officers, though that's also quite complicated. And there are lots of interesting stories. So it just seems like someone who thinks about administration really from public finance point of view. And now the public finance principles actually extend to all the constitutional principles, right? For a good source of revenue, you need stability. You need law and order. You need to make sure that the monarch is not nuts and arbitrary. You need to make sure that he doesn't surround himself by cronies, right? And doesn't have all this kind of rent-seeking and favor-seeking. You need to make sure that the palace expenditure is, under check and under a separate account and not the public account. So it just seems to me that all the constitutional principles that flow out of this are really just sensible public finance principles. And I'm trained in public finance, public choice. So to me, it just felt like, who is this guy? Where did he come from? Why does no one know about him? Is this something that you observe in his work? I mean, you've written it.
Completely got it.
Yeah. Okay.
You've completely got him. Yeah, you're exactly right. When he asks himself the question, why are the native states of India in the kind of trouble they are, right? When he takes over, Travancore's about to be swallowed up by Dalhousie and he just about rescues it. And the answer is because they haven't gotten their finances right. And of course, we have a tendency to think, if you've got a hammer, then you'll see nails. So since he comes from a revenue background, of course, he'll think revenue is the source of all their problems. But actually, there's a very deep, point in political economy or a governance that he's playing with. Now, there were two kinds of fiscal conservatism that were prominent in India in the first part of the 19th century, right? The great figure, the one who's the British praise and love, is the Divan of Mysore called Purnia, who's served as the Divan to the Wodeyars, then to Tipu Sultan, to Hyder, then to Tipu, and then back to the Wodeyars again.
Yeah. And the job that Madhava Rao eventually wants and is gunning for,
yes,
but never
exactly.
gets.
That's exactly right. He wants to take over Purnia's job, but the British don't give him the chance. They're too worried about the influence he has already. And one of the reasons he wants that job is he wants to show that there's an other way of running public finance. So what was Purnia famous for? This first style of divanship, till Madhava Rao turns up on the picture and totally revolutionizes it. And you were right when you said, why don't people know about this person? The ordinary sort of person who thinks about Indian history, or even scholars, don't realize the magnitude of the change that occurs under Madhava Rao. Before him, all divans are celebrated for basically controlling expenditure. That's the key skill, right? You find ways to manipulate your debts. You don't pay your debts. You give haircuts to, all sorts of financial houses and bankers and so on. You find ways to squeeze the poor farmer. You change rents. You change contracts. Your crucial thing is limit expenditure and squeeze out as much income from them as you possibly can. And if you can't squeeze any more income, at least cut expenditure. So you get relatively little. It's not like you don't get any expenditure on public goods. You do, but it's quite restrictive, and it's often concentrated in the visible areas around, the major center, or wherever the king might live, or whatever religious and other sites they hold important. So the classic example is like a person like Tukoji Holkar, who Madhava Rao goes to work for. His town today, Indore, which after Madhava Rao begins this process of becoming one of the cleanest towns in India, it's often called that even now. At the time Madhava Rao goes there are regularly fires that burn down most of the town. There's cholera. There's almost no public hospitals of any description. There's just some sort of random clinics. And there's dilapidated jails, no roads. It's all slush. So when it rains, you just kind of basically can't use any public transportation. This is the world Madhava Rao sees. And the problem with that system, even with Tukoji Holkar, who considers himself his own best divan, is when you cut expenditure, you basically leave the individual completely at the mercy of elements and chance and everything else that comes with it. Madhava Rao changes the story by saying we can solve the fiscal problems of the native states, not by cutting expenditure, but by growing income. And the way you grow income, right, such basic, but it's a very important kind of philosophical, it's a switch in how you think about the problem. And to us today, of course, and post 1990, 91, as you were saying, these things seem obvious in retrospect. But at the time, telling people that, look, you need to provide public goods such that individuals and engage in enterprise. When they grow, you grow. That classic all good comes from individual good, sort of that view. Getting that going or thinking it through is his major contribution. And I'll just add this much, that it's not like others, when they see the company, don't get it, that he is, purely an intellectual genius. In fact, his real genius, I think, lies in one, understanding that, but in number two, in seeing that you have to actually carry it through. You have to deliver. You can't just say, I want markets to grow, or I want, because the problem for most of the princely states was even when they got good advice from residents, they were just terrible at state building, because to make markets work, to make tax collection work, to make taxes go on the basis of income tax rather than the basis of indirect taxes, which they all did, right? Indirect tax is so easy to do and so inequitable. These changes required recruitment, promotion, screening of candidates, all of this sort of stuff. And this is what he was good at. So he was, I'd say maybe, I've come around to the answer. He's both a public finance guy, but he's also a brilliant HR guy.
He is.
Because you have to make those two things run in sync. The HR folks or the good human resources make the public finance system work. And so that's this marriage that he accomplishes.
The other thing, you're absolutely right. Again, the Enlightenment insight that, by promoting individual interest, you can align through institutions and promote social interest, right? But he also flips it on its head in the sense that that's also his first fundamental principle that he teaches all the princes, the minor wards who have been sent to him for basically an education in, statecraft. First in Travancore and then in Baroda to a more limited extent. But the starting point in both cases and in these lectures is you can do good for yourself, but only by doing good for your people. That's like the number one rule. And what I found remarkable is he manages to connect that Enlightenment principle to local custom. Whether it is through dharma or whether it is through how the ancestors have behaved in Travancore or, the long lineage in Baroda. It's very much about how do we marry this principle in some way with local custom such that this can actually sink in to the monarch and how important that figure is in making that credible commitment to law and order, stability, sensible taxes, no arbitrary decision-making, and so on.
Yeah, that's right. He encounters both when he teaches the princes in Travancore himself, then his family, his sons become tutors to Holkar in Indore. Then he himself again is deeply involved in Sayaji Rao's education. And through this whole process, he certainly places a lot of emphasis and hopes, as much as he can and works as much as he can to get princes to accept these ideas. But he's completely willing and recognizes that simply putting good ideas before princes doesn't mean that they will absorb them and follow them. And so he uses exactly as you said, a whole set of other devices. And not that he's doing this cynically or something. He really himself does believe it. He tries to draw on a set of other devices. One, he says, so don't think you're doing what I'm telling you are quote unquote English ideas. These are universal ideas. And I think that's really important about him, that he sees what he's aiming for. Again and again, he says in the books, the principles that I'm telling you are the principles of the British, but they're also principles that our forefathers have expounded and elaborated. It's just I'm giving it to you in a slightly different language and with different examples and allusions, but it's the same thing. So that's one, he appeals to dharma. The other, both in Travancore and particularly in Baroda, is to appeal to local or regional pride, right? Your ancestors founded this state. You don't want it to be swallowed up. If you don't want it to be swallowed up, you've got to do these things because it's very clear you're currently digging yourself into a hole and the hole will only grow deeper if you don't do these things. And so there's that sort of appeal to, communal or to pride in one's ancestors. And then I think the last appeal often, which is usually the most ineffective in his case, is to appeal to expertise. Look, I've done these things. Look at my track record. Look at the results I can provide you. Defer to experts. And he tries this, and the person he's least successful with is Sayaji Rao, who often wants to believe he can do these things. He's smart enough. And again, Madhava Rao tries to convince him, look, these things are no matter how smart, no matter how talented, everyone has to delegate. It's just the nature of specialization, the division of time and labor. Again, also ideas from Smith and others. And so he doesn't succeed as much on this idea of deferring to expertise and technocrats, but he does make quite significant headway on the first two. He uses a whole range of these approaches to try and convince rulers to do the right thing.
How much of his exceptionalism do you attribute to the simultaneous emergence of the railways? One, it is a part of the state capacity building process, right? And also eliminates a lot of the regional differences within the princely states. Because there are parts of princely states, the big cities where the palaces, which have always been, somewhat well off. There are the far off, farmers and the ryots who are not plugged into the global trade system, who are really suffering. So one of the things he does, and in fact, that's part of what happens in Indore, even though they don't completely take all his advice, but he's very much part of bringing railways to Indore and building that out. When he's teaching Sayaji Rao, he talks about how you can't really behave badly anymore. Free speech is part of the program now. And he's like, you have the railways. Nothing is really within the walls, of the fort anymore. Everything goes out fairly quickly and people will find out about the malfunctioning state or the lack of governance and so on. And it seems like railways is this very important ally, both in improving public finance by plugging himself into global trade routes, but also in some sense integrating what were originally, slightly sort of aloof palace politics into the broader British Indian system, but also with their neighbors and other princely states and what's going on there.
That's a really, really lovely observation, a very profound point. The 1860s, which is Madhava Rao's great decade in Travancore, when he really makes a success of the place, for the rest of India, exactly as you said, and for the reasons you pointed out, is a transformative decade. And we often forget when we think back to that period, because we often tend to think about very material revenue facts. We think about the agricultural system. For many years, our historians have focused on that aspect of or on trade. We tend not to think as much about the impact that technology has on India at this time. And there's 2 or 3 major changes. The first is exactly as you said, the railways, which reduce journey times. I mean, when Madhava is young, it can take 1 to 2 months to get from Travancore to Tanjore. And this journey, though not in the years he's there, but soon after, is reduced to a matter of a week or so, right? So this is a phenomenal change in the ability to transfer information. Then there's another one, because the 1860s are also the decade in which the telegraph appears in India. And this is, I've got this, one of my favorite little letters that I have saved up is of the Governor General in India receiving, or at that point now already the Viceroy, receiving a telegram from Salisbury in London, the Secretary for India, and to whom he replies and he says, is it not incredible to be able to receive a message in less than 4 days? Because that was, the fastest they could possibly work within India. And now it was almost instantaneous. So the telegraph, when you take the railways, which allow newspapers to be distributed, and the telegraph, which allows correspondents to communicate back to their bases, the third missing piece in this puzzle, which I just gave away, are newspapers. You get the emergence of public opinion in a way that really has not existed prior to the 1850s, 1860s. Let me be really clear. There are akhbars. The Maratha world, the Mughal world, the princely states are full of akhbars, full of rumors and all sorts of conflicting and confounding stories. Just this morning, I was looking through a set of archival documents where a correspondent, this is in the 1820s, writes back and says, I'm really confused. There's 4 different rumors. I don't know which one is true. So clearly my being here makes no difference compared to your being there. He's writing to his editor in Calcutta. This is in the 1820s. By the 1860s, this issue is more or less gone because you're on the spot and you can report in the day or change the story the next day, and that's that. So the world of the akhbars, which are fairly ragged and confused and, rumor bound, is giving way to structured public opinion, where there are opinion editorials, where there are reports and follow-up reports, and a story is doggedly chased. And the moment the British press starts to expand in the 1850s and 60s, you start to get Parsi and other newspapers, particularly in the western part of India where the Parsi community is dominant, writing either bilingual or English papers of their own. And they're even better connected into the flow of information and news. So now Madhava Rao says, exactly as you put it, the combination of newspapers circulated by train and reported by telegraph means you really fundamentally need to think twice about the way you behave. And the old days are gone for good. There's been a structural, material change in the world around you.
And I was just struck by how he might have been one of the first few people in positions of power to have that insight, because it's happening while he is on the job. And, for about 100 years after that, the dominant narrative was, the railways were brought in as the tool for extraction, right? The British extraction. And then, to support the war effort, in the early 20th century. And, the late 19th century, early 20th century, it's also about diverting food away from famine and drought areas, the pandemic, the plagues and the Spanish flu spreading through the railways. So the railways, in one sense, the dominant narrative was just get a really bad rep, right? And of course, in economics, now more recently, we have Dave Donaldson, who's actually estimated sort of the general equilibrium impact of the railways and finds what matches our current intuition, right? It eliminates all these price arbitrage that you have between different regions. It increases real income, right? It reduces the transactions costs of trade and, so on. And the fact that Madhava Rao figured this out while the railways were being built in other places and brought it to his principalities to be built and was sort of able to see this long-term impact, I find that truly remarkable. He's not an engineering guy. He's not really, because the company and the crown also had, a group of surveyors and civil engineers and, there was that cadre, and he's not from that, but he somehow has cracked this insight, which most people have still not cracked like 100 years after the event.
I'm working on his biography and I've gone through every last scrap of information. It's taken years and years of digging. I have everything down to his examination papers. I managed to dig them up, because he was such a model student. They ended up getting published in a book of model essays by students. No one knows these exist, and I managed to find them. And in these model essays, he's writing when he's 17 and 18. Model essays, from the perspective of the British. From his perspective, he's just sitting his examinations. And they are full of an appreciation, because what he studied and loved the absolute most, he always loved English, and he was a master of English literature and writing and so on. But what really was his passion all through schooling, all through his life, his hobby sort of on a daily basis was science of one kind or another. He loved physics, chemistry, not as much biology, but he loved particularly how they were applied. And so these essays that he writes for his high school, which I found, are all about the importance of applying science to solving modern problems, to make human life more convenient, to make trade smoother and faster, and to, exactly as you put it, eliminate distortions. And so wherever he goes, as soon as he enters Travancore, the first thing he starts pushing for is an engineering department, which his predecessors had created but lacked money. They didn't have the funds to do much with it. The office itself fell into dysfunction. Indeed, Travancore was almost swallowed up by the British. So the moment he got the surpluses going within 2 years, he rolls out a brand new engineering department, its own set of surveyors who aren't working for the company so that they will, do the job that he wants them to do. And he sets about doing a set of 2 or 3 things that we, again, as you were putting it, we would now think of as our intuitions would suggest are the right things to do. Build ports, because in Travancore, that's essential to trade. Clean up lagoons, which in Travancore, the backwaters, essential to connectivity and trade. Sort out public markets, which many of his predecessors had been keen on, places like Kottayam, etc., and organize these markets so that you remove unfair taxes and arbitrary kind of rent collections and things of that kind. So, and then of course, railways, as you said. So try and connect up wherever you can. In Travancore, his big focus was roads, and then in Indore and Baroda, because of their particular strategic location, in all sorts of ways, they were a junction for everything, for carrying crops, for troops, for trade, for commerce, all kinds of things. So as you were saying, the railways have gotten a bad rap. They were deeply important to central India and made it, in fact, a junction point because of its amazing centrality. They also helped eliminating famines. They may have caused or exacerbated famines at one point, but at others, they helped provide relief supplies quickly. So he noticed these features. And why I was giving this Travancore story is that it wasn't just railways for him, it was all of these. Every form of connectivity was valuable because it would reduce distortions, allow trade to flourish, open up avenues of trade and enterprise. And so he went for all of them. And light railways in Baroda, the big Grand Trunk in Indore, thousands of miles of road in Travancore, and so on.
If I remember correctly from your introduction, I think you said he inherited about 50 miles of broken roads and he leaves Travancore with over 1,000 miles of pretty good roads, right? Where you can have serious goods trade.
That's right. And so if you look at the statistics, recently I was giving a presentation on some of the long-term consequences of the kinds of things that Rao got going. And if you look at connectivity in Travancore, even in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, it has more public transport than British India, than any of the other principalities because of this vast road network. It has more hospitals. It has more sort of trade and port avenues per person, per capita than any other native state. All of this is sort of a long-term consequence of this thinking.
How much of modern day Kerala's success do you attribute not just to what happened under Madhava Rao, but more generally, that time and the leadership in Travancore, both his uncle before him, but also, the princes that he tutored who took over and very strongly created this tradition of, investment in public goods and infrastructure, building state capacity, both human capital, physical capital, and so on. And can you draw a direct line to how Kerala is, sort of acing all the development indicators even today? Or is that just too far-fetched?
No, I think I'm working on this. This is actually exactly in the midst of what I'm on now. There's the famous debate over the Kerala model. And I've been looking at this paper that Amartya Sen wrote in the early 1990s called the India's Missing Millions. And in that paper, there's this one line where he says, Travancore or Kerala's successes have to be traced back to the enlightened policies of its monarchs, to which then a number of figures responded very upset and said, surely it's a result of communist rule since the 1950s. And that's what's really responsible for the Kerala model. And Sen makes a really nice point, which I've then been digging further. I think this creates some complications for his own theory. I don't know if he wanted to always say this, but he pointed out that in 1949, 1951, when the first major survey census happens right after independence, before the communists have come to power, Travancore's public developmental statistics are significantly, on almost every factor, 2 to 3 times better than the rest of India. So that gives us as clear a bit of evidence as you want that Travancore in 1950, or at the time of independence, was already head and shoulders above on almost every public development indicator, even though its income was just middling, which tells us already for 100, 150 years, funds had been spent in a particular way. And so what we tend to celebrate about Kerala, its high levels of human development, were already in place by 1950. And I've now been working backwards. So I've also collected the census data from prior decades. And I was recently, presenting this material. And as far back as 1901, for example, which is the first major census that Kerala under Madhava Rao and others also conducts its own censuses, but we don't have matching data for British India. So I haven't been able to do the comparisons. But in 1901, for instance, life expectancy in Travancore is twice that of British India, twice. So it's about 28 or 29. It's a bad year because of the plague, but the flu, but British India is 29 and Travancore is 47. I mean, so it really gives you a sense of the scale of the difference. And this is 1901. So, I think the Kerala story cannot be told without the monarchs. It's not just Madhava Rao. The story begins about 3 or 4 decades before him, both with his father and his uncle, but actually a figure even before them, which is someone I'm now writing about. And the book is called From Swords to Words, which is basically the story of how we go from revolutionary violence in the 18th century, as you were saying, to a very different approach to development and politics in the 19th century. And it's this transition that occurs starting in about 1810 in Travancore that sets the story in motion for the next 140 years, which gives Travancore those amazing statistics in 1950. So I think it's a long story and it can't just be a modern contemporary one.
Yeah. And, one, of course, those of us who actually dig into the archives and are studying all this historical material, we realize just, history just casts a very long shadow. But the interesting thing about that time and now, everything you've said about Travancore and putting it in perspective is early 19th century, if I were to use very public choice terms and, sort of Mansur-Olson-esque thinking, the company goes from being a roving bandit in Bengal and thereabouts to becoming a stationary bandit starting in the south. And the Travancore princely state, is probably the first to follow suit in terms of becoming the stationary bandit. Tipu Sultan would have been, had he not, been defeated. That would have been the line which was the other stationary bandit, building state capacity, public works, maximizing revenue for its people, sort of the residual claimant, even with a super sovereign hovering around them. So that's my hunch on how this is playing out. And the state capacity story is much more important. We tell the institutional story, we tell the story of education or, the zamindari system and extraction. But I feel like the state capacity story is the link that sort of, separates all the good places from the terrible places in one sense.
I've actually was literally citing this Olson piece, this famous essay of his that sets that story in motion in something I was writing earlier today. And that's exactly it. The realization that to have a going enterprise, to stop, as I put it in this thing I was writing, you have to stop roaming and start ruling, citing Olson. And that requires putting in place, instead of plunder and extortion and nazars, as they were called at the time, bribes of various kinds and honorariums, you need a system of taxation. And taxation won't work unless you have a system of honest tax collectors. And you won't have a system of honest tax collectors unless you have a working bureaucracy. And a bureaucracy won't work if you don't have an education system that can provide you with the manpower, the people power. And an education system won't come into place unless you fund and build all the supporting paraphernalia around it. And that's the model, and so that's where this entire generation in Travancore, Mysore, Tanjore, and then slowly working its way upwards into Maharashtra, that's the model that all of these princely states start to copy. And it begins with Travancore, which they all then mimic in one way or another.
I can't wait to read this paper because I am looking at something on the Permanent Settlement Act and East India Company. I'm looking at property rights. So, all this background stories coming in a big way. And I keep thinking, oh my God, they act like they're a stationary bandit, but they're actually a roving bandit because they keep extracting taxes to fund wars to gain territory in other parts of the country, right? But they look like they're governing Bengal, which they're really not governing. The Permanent Settlement Act gives it a veneer of, oh, we're really in charge and we're going to be the revenue collectors, but they're really not. So I've been toying with this idea. I never knew how quite to frame it. But I guess after I read your paper, I'll get some sense of how to think about this. One question I have, both when I read the book on Madhava Rao and your other book, To Raise a Fallen People, these are, volumes that have come out back to back. They're based on your archival research, on the huge public repository you've created, also called Ideas of India, which we'll get to, in a bit. But what strikes me is somehow there's like this gap suddenly. It's almost as if, we know about the Mughals until the late 18th century, and then India's history really starts, in the 1900s. Maybe 1890s, because we'll talk about, the formation of the Congress and Dadabhai Nauroji in the House of Commons. But there's like 100 years in the middle, which has just disappeared, right? And it's a very strange epistemic gap What do you think is the reason for it? That these people disappeared from popular imagination? Is it because Indian nationalists are writing the history of modern India, so they really think it ought to begin with Gokhale and Tilak and, all the sort of crucial native leaders of the Indian National Congress? Or is it because, people like Madhava Rao were really aligned with the princely states, who at the end of the day are allies of the British? When history is being written by the nationalists, there's a tendency for them to get left out. I also have a feeling that might be part of the story, because we know a lot about Nauroji, but we know nothing about Bhavanagri, who is also one of the very important, leaders, but he's conservative, not aligned with the nationalist movement, part of, the conservative support in the House of Commons. So why is there this gap? It just makes no sense to me, because it is so close in history and we rely on sources much before that and much after that. But for 100 years, it's like, this time didn't exist.
Yeah, well, you've asked the question that, keeps me employed and up at night. I'm still sometimes baffled by it, because you turn to the archives and you look at the richness of the material out there and the incredible turning points. It's astonishing that people would pass it up in the past. So I want to think it's a mixture of things that have happened. I think one is I have personally benefited from the fact that we live in the midst of this information revolution, and it's now possible to use all kinds of tools and techniques. So a simple one is the British Library have placed their archives into various trees that you can start to map out the archives in a way that someone working in the 60s, 70s would have struggled with when you were looking at paper rolls and paper copies. So I now have in my head an absolute, complete, perfect sort of image of what the British bureaucracy looked like between 1800 and 1950. And that lets me, if I need to know this thing, will it actually be in police, or will it be in judiciary? In judiciary, will it be in this or in that? You get this sense because now you can see the whole thing in front of you. And any person can go in and start constructing this tree relatively, I think, quickly now, because we have these trees available to us. So that's one thing I think that makes our time slightly different from preceding generations, to give them their fair share in terms of the disadvantages they faced. I think the second, you hit the nail on the head on the nationalist movement. It's not just that the nationalist movement wants to tell a very cohesive narrative of its heroes that gave rise and took part in especially the early Congress. And then the story just kind of gradually transforms. And so, lo and behold, we get to 47 and then the action begins. The tendency there, it's not just a cohesive story with a given set of figures, as you pointed out with Bhavanagri and others. They actually then lose even people who were part of the nationalist movement or the freedom movement, but weren't part of the Congress. They get sort of obliterated from the picture. And then, exactly as you also said, the third problem is that so much of what happens when we think about Indians sorting out problems for themselves between 1800 and, let's say, 1875, 1880, most of the domains of freedom where you can be inventive, where you can be experimental, are in the princely states. And there's just such an immense amount of work and variety happening there, because the princely states after the 1910s become very anxious about the Congress, which is increasingly moving to the left, is increasingly becoming hostile, not so much to, of course, they're hostile to monarchy, but they're hostile also to landed interests. They're hostile to markets. They're hostile toward the idea of war and militaries and all of those sorts of things, because they're moving either in a pacifist direction or they're moving in a communist direction. Both those two major movements in ideas after the Second World War, after the 1920s, makes the princes kind of push back. And because the princes push back and kind of shut themselves away, once more returning to their aloof palaces and kingdoms, everyone who's been associated with them in the past is also sort of cabined away, as if they're reactionary. That's the term that's often used between 1920 and 1950. Again and again, we see the princes described as either feudal or reactionary in this denigrating way. And that's what I was saying, sort of the thing that keeps me up at night, that I hope people will understand and realize that the story of the 19th century is not the story of India after the First World War. These are completely different universes. In the 19th century, Indians are dazed, confused, and baffled by everything that's happened to them. The simplest way I can put it is something I'm going to actually write a tweet about and an extended story about in a few days. There's a very famous essay that was published in 1852. And the title of this essay is "From a Factory We Grew to a Kingdom." It was written in the Friend of India, which was the great paper in Bengal. And it said, between 1756 and 1852, in 100 years, more or less, give or take, we've gone from a factory to covering this entire subcontinent. Look at how incredible we are. And look at what we've managed to accomplish. This is the act of providence and divinity, right? The irony is exactly at the moment they're writing that is the beginning of the Indian return, the Indian Renaissance from 1850 to 1950. And 100 years later, India is free. And so what I want people to understand is that the 19th century tells us why in 100 years, India could collapse. And in 100 years, India could be resurrected. The junction point of those two stories, our utter collapse and our incredible revival, is in the 19th century. That's where those two eras meet. If we don't understand the 19th century, we cannot understand why we failed and why we recovered. That's the thing.
That's so well put. I always try to think about what are the incentives for people to preserve history, to write their own history and so on. So, the British have preserved documents that serve their interests, like all the correspondence they have with the different divans or the princely states. Much of it is mundane, but, it tells us a lot about that time. And as a class of, modern day scholars who are educated in English, who know how to work through these archives, that's really what we rely on. So, one part of the loss is the regional languages and what was done at the time. But the other part of the loss is what was written in English, because these were princely states that had to communicate with the crown and with, first the company and then the crown. But over a period of time, they not just lost their relevance and importance, but also lost their source of revenue. So how much of the loss of the archives of the princely states do you think is because of something like, the 26th Amendment and abolishing the privy purses? They basically have no money to maintain their own history, This is technically their family history. They'd like to have the pictures. They'd like to have, the plaques commemorating who built what, but that just seems to have disappeared, right? Do you think the archival base of India would have been different had we had this, this layer of aristocracy, which is not particularly pleasant for anyone. But at the end of the day, it does have the money to support the arts, to maintain libraries, to have archives, and to really create a link between the present and the past, culturally or intellectually.
That's a really interesting question. I think what should have been done, what could have been done, is to have collected those archives, because they were all centralized. In one way or another, every princely state had its daftars where these documents were kept. In some cases, like with Saiji Rao, one reason I was able to write this book at all, or write any of the other things that I'm working on, was because the Baroda Records route was added into the Gujarat State Archives, and that saved it. When I contacted the state archives in Indore, they had no idea what I was talking about. They were like, no such thing ever existed. And I was like, no, you mean you don't have Holkar's papers? The most important principality of central India, raging through all of central India, Rajasthan, the terror of the region, you have nothing. And they were like, well, we have some documents from 1960, maybe somewhere. And it was, I just stared into space for a while and, uttered lots of curse words and to myself. You're left flabbergasted at what's been lost. And that loss makes me think the way it's happened is that, one, this Indian state failed us because it disregarded those native states for the reasons we were just discussing previously. But also it tells us the weakness of the Indian aristocracy. They never really cared enough to learn or to appreciate more than their privileges. That was always the problem. Again and again and again, you hear and you see, there was Madhava Rao, there are others in his era who wrote to princes, wrote letters, wrote memoranda, advised, educated. And again, the lesson was, your privileges are important, but the greatest privilege you have is to be above others with more resources that you can use. It's not to get nazars, and it's not to have people bow to you. It's not to have all this wealth. It's to be the keeper of traditions and memories and order. And our aristocracy was, is, and will be an utter failure because of any sense of an esprit de corps, that they have a mission greater than themselves. They will preserve paintings so that they can sell them. They will preserve forts so that they can turn them into luxury hotels. They will preserve other items, cars and memorabilia, so that they can sell them through auctioneers in London. The sense that they have a deeper mission to their civilization is, I fear, lost on them. And that was lost on them a while ago. It's not just a contemporary event. And so when independence came, the idea was, by and large, there are a few families that don't necessarily meet this condemnation, but the others, the great bulk do, was let's get all we can out of this, because now we're mostly left with, the Johor Bagh full of royal families that basically bought plots of land in Delhi and kept their plots of lands out in their homes. Johor Bagh and Prithviraj Row, the kind of classic versions of minor royalty of various kinds that have given up the hope, given up the flame, and are living off the fat of the land. And that's it. That's all that really motivates them.
Yeah, and the one person who is probably an exception in that pack is Sayaji Rao Gaikwad, the then minor prince of Baroda who becomes the monarch of Baroda. And it's a complicated relationship, It's not the same relationship that Madhava Rao had with the Princess of Travancore. He's not exactly allowed to educate him, but, eventually gains some influence in educating him. And the Kingdom of Baroda actually ends up being very progressive. I mean, today, if there are three reasons we think about Sayaji Rao Gaikwad, it is one, he funded Ambedkar's education, which you can possibly trace back to a note by Madhava Rao where he talks about, you need to have education, you need to spot talented people, pay for scholarships so they can get higher education outside the principality and, things like that. So I don't know if I'm drawing too direct a connection. And the other, of course, he's the grandfather of Gayatri Devi and, the founder of Bank of Baroda and sort of, that kind of legacy that he has. But his papers are pretty well preserved and it's also a very large state. It's almost one of the European countries.
So, it's about the size of Greece, I guess.
At the end of the book, you have this lovely appendix where there's literally a draft constitution by Madhava Rao, which is something that I had no idea about until I read your appendix. I knew that there were draft constitutions in play from, the first full draft that I had read was the Motilal Nehru draft, 1928-29. Now, more recently, through this wonderful paper that Rohit Dey and Ornit Shani have written, I have learned that there is actually, not one draft, but many hundreds at this point, all sorts of different constitutions are being written in the different princely states, some of them to govern the princely states as a constitutional monarchy, some of them as part of the larger question of, how India must govern itself eventually. And I can't think of anything before 1875. So is Madhava Rao the very first sort of constitutionalist in India coming up with a very modern draft constitution? It has all, right against search and seizure, like protections against search and seizure. It has habeas corpus. It has protections limiting the eminent domain power. It's remarkably modern, if one were to sit down and write it today. So where is this coming from, first of all? Is he the first one? And why didn't we have more of these and know about more of these?
Yeah, it's always dangerous when one's doing history to lay a flag down, but I believe he is the first. I have not seen at all any other indications before this time of something like a serious, fully worked out constitution with a clear principle and structure, not some line in a letter or something of that kind. So this is the first. He writes it because after an entire career in the princely states and the legacies through his father and his uncle that he is aware of, which is another 50 years before that, he has realized that, as we were saying right at the beginning of this conversation, you can try and educate princes, you can try and put in place a state or a bureaucracy, but you will not be able to fundamentally make a modern state work without limitations on, as long as there is the ability of the king or the prince or the queen to interfere. As long as there's a shred of arbitrariness, it can grow. If there's a crack in the door, it'll keep opening further and further. And so his great goal towards the end of his life, his greatest hope, which doesn't come to be realized tragically, is to constrain arbitrariness. And for all that he's learned and done, he teaches all the principles. He can tell you how to sort out your public finances, as we've been discussing. He can tell you how to hire and recruit and promote people. He can tell you how to manage your diplomacy. But none of these things will work if you can't curb your own behavior. And so his great goal, Sayaji Rao, and then he hopes when Sayaji Rao does it, others will mimic Sayaji Rao because of Baroda's great, and at that point, all eyes on Baroda because it's such a unique experiment. And unfortunately for him, he fails. And this goes to the heart of then the problem of the princely states later, what we were talking about earlier. When the princes are confronted with a growing Congress movement in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, and then as we come close to 1947, the princes realize there's no future for them because their model of governance and their model of succession has no place in the modern world. Madhava Rao had given them back in 1875 a way in which they could have a perennial existence. They could have a continued existence. They could have been compatible with voting, as, say, for example, a place like Mysore gradually went in that direction. It didn't have voting, but at least it had representation. And that's exactly what Madhava Rao wanted. And then representation could have been compatible with, as it is in England, with democratic elections. So his great hope had been, when he wrote this constitution, he saw very clearly, and that's why it's such an important, incredible document. It's important not just because it's the first, and there's a whole story behind why he's the first, but it's important more than being first. It's the content. It's the recognition of the realization that specifically here we're talking about princely states have no future if they don't solve the problem of arbitrariness. And this was a change that was occurring throughout Europe at this time. Madhava Rao was watching it. He could see its good effects, especially in a place like England. And he wanted India and native states in India to follow suit. That was his goal. And that was why he wrote the constitution. And because it was rejected or not adopted by the princely states, they ended up with a blank wall when 1947 came around. There was no other way for them to continue.
So how much of this is because Madhava Rao also sees the transition from rule under company to rule under crown, right? I mean, this is the British monarchy. Of course, they've had a, 7th, 8th century, lead to what's happening in some of the princely states in India. But that's a constitutional monarchy where the ruler is very much bound, not just by parliament, but also by rules. He, I think, references the Magna Carta. I think he says something like the events in Runnymede in a couple of those constitutional provisions, right? So it seems like that is the model. He's also read the American Constitution because the takings clause that I was looking at, because that's interesting to me, it says, I think there's something like this in the American Constitution. So how much of that switch is bringing about this view that, hey, a constitutional monarchy is a possibility in India and the way forward if we ever need to get out of, this kind of, foreign rule, as we call it?
Right. Yeah, I think so. It's a very nice observation. I think you're right that after 1857, the beginning of crown rule certainly has an impact, not just on him and on others in the princely states, as a different model for how princes should function. They're seen, especially after 1877, they're seen as part of the extended royal family of Great Britain. But I think for Madhava Rao in particular, the crown gives him an example. It's not that they're influencing him. His ideas are, I think, already in place in the 1840s and 50s as he's kind of forming his and concretizing his view of the world. He's reading people like Burke and he's reading people like Montesquieu. And he thinks there is a place for monarchy in the world. And in the 1850s or 60s, it would have been almost impossible for anyone to think that India was going to become democratic. So for him, the natural way forward would have been to think of liberalizing and regularizing monarchy so that it becomes more hospitable in the modern world and accommodates itself to modernity. So reading Burke, reading Montesquieu, figures of that kind, reading Tocqueville, who he also thought very highly of, he could see a way forward, which involved this constitutionalism and a constitutional monarchy. And then when, after 1858, the crown takes over, it becomes one in that arsenal of different devices he can use. Appeals to patriotism, appeals to pride, appeals to education, and also appeals to the English example as ways to convince his monarchs to do the right thing. And once again, it has limited impact because the Marathas, for instance, say, well, that's what you do in England. But we Marathas were born on a saddleback, right? The Maratha state emblem is, the cows, and the flag has the horse on it. A Maratha without a horse is meaningless. He can't win against the Maratha nobles. And he's seen as this Madrasi, as they call him, who's come with his newfangled ideas and should go back, right? He has a tough going.
The other thing that struck me about this constitution is that not only is it modern, by Indian standards, it's also very modern by British standards. It has very clear separation of powers, much stronger than what is observed in England at the time. The provisions for an independent judiciary, how they're appointed, can they hold other jobs, provision actually is something that looks a lot like impeachment. You can't just dismiss a judge. Of course, the Constituent Assembly version, which decides to step away from the British system and have an independent judiciary. We have some version of it now, but that's a separate matter. So it's just remarkably modern even in that. So, he just feels like he's sprouted out of somewhere every time I read him, because it doesn't feel like this is really talking about Tanjore or Mysore, where he grew up. He's not just borrowing from Travancore and Baroda, and he's not just borrowing from, the Enlightenment thinkers he read. He's actually trying to make a much clearer, sort of incentive compatible system, what we now call, something that has checks and balances and the different powers are aligned. So it it just feels very strange that this is not mentioned in any of the constitutional documents later. We don't invoke, when we're talking about Purn Swaraj and the Motilal Nehru Constitution, I don't remember reading a mention of him or, this particular document. Tej Bahadur Sapru wrote a version, a draft of the Constitution. I don't remember a reference to Madhava Rao. And I believe from, what Rohit and Ornith have written, that 62 states framed their own constitution and 286 others were involved in making constitution. So I'm now becoming more and more curious about this narrative that the princely states were just, these backwaters full of opulence, declining military power, warring factions and palace intrigue and no modernism, right? Except maybe Mysore and Travancore. We'll name a couple of folks and we get on with it. It's just a very strange telling of our own history. And in some sense, I feel the modern day nationalism wouldn't quite look like this if only we read what our very recent history is, in a homegrown sense, not in a imposed by Macaulay or is a narrative. This is a very homegrown institutional setup that we seem to have lost this connection somewhere.
Yeah, that's very nicely put. One reason why so few people would have known about it after the turn of the century is partly because Madhava Rao is blackballed, because he was part of the Congress, played a very important role in building it up. He was associated with the National Indian Social Conference. And so, because for his view was social reform before political reform, right? And so that made him unlikable to the National Congress. He also was opposed to the idea of representation on a one person, one vote idea straight away. He was okay with it later down the path, but not immediately. So these two things meant that people didn't want to talk about him too much. But the other was that he didn't go around seeking publicity for all his views. He certainly enjoyed his public persona. He gave speeches. He knew he was popular. He knew he was famous. His picture would appear in newspapers throughout India. His columns would be carried. So he knew he was famous, but he didn't relish it or revel in it. So I have to tell everyone what I did, or everyone must know. So when he wrote this constitution originally, it was written in private. It was written for the viceroy and the rulers and not shared publicly. And later, when it did become public knowledge, he never admitted that he was the one who wrote it. So people knew a native had written it. No one knew he had written it. I was able to put the dots together because I found his correspondence that showed that he'd actually written it. So I would say maybe even up till the 1930s or 40s, people did not know that he had written this constitution. That's why, his part of the story gets lost. But the broader question, or the broader observation you made, how tragic it is that we know so little about the princely states and the liberalism and the ideals that grew up organically, naturally in these places. It is a huge loss, and it's a huge problem, because I will lose my voice saying this, but I will just keep saying it again and again, that we think English education came to India and English ideas came to India with Macaulay. The first English school in India was set up in 1784 in Tanjore by the Maharaja of Tanjore. It was not even an English-educated Maharaja. He could see that there was a value to learning these ideas that were making the British so successful. And just from a purely instrumental point of view, it was worth having people that could trade and translate and engage in commerce and business and enterprise in multiple languages. English came to India 50 years before Macaulay turned up there. Right. The first major sets of schools and institutions were set up in Madras before the English set up the Madras High School. It was set up because Indians asked for this school to be set up. They signed and created a monster petition, as it was called at the time, of 50,000 signatures from the gentlemen of Madras asking for the Madras High School to be set up for our enlightenment and progress. So it's very important for us to understand that in the 19th century, when Indians looked at their circumstances, they thought long and hard about the things that had caused them to be colonized. It's not like they just read Macaulay or read Mill and said, we were colonized because we were back. We're foolish. We don't know anything. They loved and respected their culture. They loved and respected their institutions, but they recognized there must be something deficient in them for this great catastrophe to have fallen upon our people, that everything that we had was simply overrun in the space of 30 or 40 years or 50 years at the most. And so they earnestly ask themselves the question that, have we really got all the knowledge in the world that's out there? Do we possess it? No, we don't. And that sense of openness and self-awareness and self-criticism is a constant feature of the 19th century. And that's something we should be proud of. So it's something we should admire about ourselves, that we were willing to adapt and learn and change in the face of hard realities. And so Madhava Rao and others get forgotten, but in fact, they're the ones who did that learning. We are their beneficiaries because they learned the lessons and we inherited them and then turned a deaf ear or turned a blind eye to where we got them from.
So, this is where I love your other project, which kind of, I guess, has given birth to all these other books that you're working on. This is the Ideas of India. I think the website is ideasofindia.org. It is an extraordinary public database and a repository of our history. I think you have about, 400 plus journals. And these are all basically journals written in English. They're periodicals, some are every month, some are, quarterly and so on. And they have these articles, all of which are written by Indians talking about India at that time. And they're not periodicals in the sense of they're telling us what happened yesterday and, some event. They're not event-based. They're very ideas-based. And once again, this is something that I was simply not aware of until you created this database. For instance, you also reference, some of these thinkers in the other edited volume. These are like, Bhola Nath Chandra or Kishan Mohan Malik, P. Anantacharlu. They are free trade folks, right? When people have always asked me in a history of thought sense, why aren't there any free trade ideas? India used to be this huge, global trading powerhouse. When you look at the Madison Project and you look at the data and so on. And I was like, we had these trading routes, but then the British came and it turns into a mercantilist project and people confuse free trade and mercantilism. And then India goes socialist, right? This is the Cliff Notes version of the story that's told to us. Of course, in the middle of this somewhere, there's a handshake between Lasky and Nehru, which is the exact method by which socialism got transferred. But, leaving that aside. But I didn't know that there is a homegrown literature and thought on critiquing mercantilism and embracing free trade. And these people, over and over again, they're saying, hey, free trade is not the reason Indians are poor, right? It is all these other mercantilist policies. In fact, Indians are poor because they are not plugged into global trade and they can't benefit from, the gains from trade. It's extraordinary, this enormous literature that you have managed to put together. So my first question is, how did this project come about? How difficult was it? And what is still missing from this repository in a sense that we don't have access to? Or is this about, a pretty good picture of the 200 years before independence that we really need to understand Indian thought, the subcontinental thought?
Yeah, thanks, Shruti. Thanks for mentioning this and bringing it up. I think it's a pretty good summary or overview because there is such a large number of journals from so many different groups and geographies and ideological viewpoints that it gives you a sense of the interplay of ideas, how many different ideas were around, how they were, because all these journals refer to one another, periodicals. They publish rival pieces because they're appealing to the same audience and trying to convince them. And, the story behind these periodicals is that this is something I think is very clear to those of us working in the archives. When you look at newspapers or weeklies, they tend to focus on contemporary events and very, very transient things. But the moment you move to monthlies, they become both fatter because, you're going to transport this thing. You might as well get as many pieces in as you can so your subscribers are satisfied with this more expensive and more voluminous text. That's also going to cost you a lot more to transmit over distance. And so the editors, right from the very beginning, have an English idea in mind, which is I want to appeal to reason and ideas and, because they've all grown up or been educated in English schools and colleges and universities in India, reading these periodicals. They want to mimic them, but apply them to an Indian context and develop an Indian public sphere. Indians debating Indian problem or Indians debating global problems. They're open to both things. They're not at all parochial. And so they focus in these monthlies or quarterlies on these big, big questions. And very quickly from the 1860s onwards, they start to ask exactly, as you said, this question of why exactly are we when we were such a wealthy country before the British came and we had traders and migrants and business interests scattered, especially across Central Asia, Southeast Asia. Why has that disappeared? It's a Bhola Nath Chandra, for example, who you mentioned, says, why are Indians simply not traveling? What's happened? We used to. We know from all these records that there were Indians in places like Armenia and in China and in Indonesia and dotted along the coast of Eastern Africa. So where's all of that gone? And so then begins this set of analyses that emphasize the importance of regenerating enterprise in India, which has been a large part of the entrepreneurial class has been wiped out by the conflict between princely states and the company, because the bankers and the commercial class have to pay both sides, trying to keep their businesses alive. And eventually the costs of business are just simply too high. And as the new commercial class starts to appear under the British, it struggles with, exactly as you put it, the mercantilism of the British, which kind of tries to nip in the bud this domestic entrepreneurial class. They want them simply to be producers of primary goods and not of services and not of industrial goods. And so Bholanath Chandra, beginning with him, he's the graduate of the first class of Hindu College in Calcutta. From then onwards, you start to get generation after generation, culminating in the greatest peak of this era, Govind Ranade, who's just absolutely incredible on this area, and Telang, his buddy and interlocutor. The two of them, represent this deep realization that the problems in India's trade is not a lack of enterprise or innovation, but simply British constraints, both on the kinds of trade you can take part in, on the kinds of capital you can raise, and the sorts of terms on which you can conduct business domestically and internationally. And so this becomes the basis of their critique, which runs all the way from the mid-1870s till the 1900s, arguing for freer markets, better integration. Ranade argues famously for more Indian migration because Indians will undertake enterprise abroad more freely than they can in India. So you better go do it somewhere else because you can't do it here. And so there is this really remarkable literature, Indian literature, that talks about the importance of markets and trade from the 1870s onwards, which has been forgotten and lost and is highly undervalued, needs to be resurrected because it tells us, just as a minute ago we were talking about liberalism in India in its social and political sense, there's liberalism in its economic sense, which really has a great renaissance up till the time Gokhale passes. And then after that, it's all downhill, as you described.
What struck me as odd is this is all in English. I would completely understand if we didn't have access to these, journals and periodicals and, they were not in English and someone had to translate. And many of these languages, we don't have good translations. But this is all in English. Of course, there are some words which are spelt, in a 19th century way or something, but they're very modern. They're written exactly like, if you were reading the Seminar or Frontline or your very modern publication, they feel a lot like that. They have rejoinders, where two people are debating. I shouldn't be surprised by this, but I was truly surprised by how wonderful, and it's a very interesting sort of, knitting together of different interests. There are, of course, the nationalist interests. There are journals which are just talking about economics. There are journals which are just talking about social reform. There's something called the Indian Ladies magazine, right? There is, of course, the one on the zamindars and the Indian princely states, which was called something else at the time. So it's quite interesting. There's Muslim Review. There's, all the things to do with Indians and, also the reformist Hindus, they have their own journals. So it's very interesting that this was going on. It's, of course, still the elite of that time. This is not a mass movement by any standards, but it exists. And the fact that now we have it, I'm deeply grateful to you, for anyone who's researching that time period to make this available. But I also feel like, in a much broader sense, given where we are culturally, I feel like this is the bridge between the very sort of macho nationalism and the historical nationalism that we have right now, and sort of this elite liberalism which a small group of people advocate. And somehow the bridge between these two is Indian history and Indian, historical and philosophical thought. And somehow you've managed to unearth the motherlode and put it up for anyone to see, and access easily. So I'm hoping this is just part of a larger change in how we write these narratives about India.
I'm hopeful that, as we become more also digitally capable right now, the ability of people to use the database, but also then to use the internet to get hold of things from all kinds of websites that they can access. One great example is archive.org, which has done an amazing job in cataloging all these and collecting all these important texts so that people can quickly access this material, which even a decade ago would have been difficult. So there's been that change. And earlier you'd asked me this question, which I should, in all fairness and honesty, also say that, what more is left? There's a lot more left. What I've done with Ideas of India helps us break in. It shows us that there's a massive, vibrant world out there. And you were saying it's in English because it's pan-Indian. So, that was the one lingua franca that could allow so many different types and groups to speak. It is elite in the sense that it's metropolitan. I often use that word. It's places where there are universities. And places you would think of as not Delhi, not Bombay, not Madras, but Lucknow, Bareilly and Patna and Tanjore. places that people today in India might think of as second or third tier cities, but in fact, back then were vibrant and alive with all sorts of interesting ideas and connected to global ideas and currents. So I think Ideas of India has done a great job or lets us see that world, but there's so much more still that if there are others out there, and I can only hope to, encourage or inspire others to do similar things, we need more of what we sometimes call subaltern histories, right? If people have family trunks somewhere that are full of letters, please hand them over. There are archives. There's one coming up at Ashoka, for instance, things that allow us to collect these little nodes, not just the big ones that I've tried to collect, the obvious large major centers, stories, family stories, regional stories, particularly those in regional languages. These things will really help us have a more textured kind of 360 view of that era, and not just the one that I've been able to uncover. The one I've been able to uncover serves my purposes. It lets me tell these larger narrative stories about the big movements. But the stories of the little guy or the little woman and the different regions will really enrich our understanding of how connected, how modern we were. I love to say we were modern before we were modern, because we tend to have this idea that, it was all archaic stuff. And the 19th century must have just been, sati or something like that till the British.
Yeah.
And we just don't realize how wonderful that era was.
Yeah, no, that's a lovely phrase. We were modern before we were modern, right? Thank you so much, Rahul. I can't thank you enough, but you must promise me that you will come back and talk about your other book, Secrets and Leaks, which is the other theme in all your work is, of course, thinking about executive power in different centuries, in different contexts, whether it's, the princely state of Baroda and Travancore, or whether it's the Americans, dealing with secrecy and executive power and military power. So this is something I really hope you can come back and discuss with us. But thank you so much. I'm just so excited about this book. To me, even on the second and third reading, it's like, I'm so excited this exists. And it's sort of like meeting an old friend. So thank you so much for doing this. Such a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you so much, Shruti. Madhava Rao has a great friend in you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and at Ideas of India. Also check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.